Hey,
Okay.
hey guys, welcome to the Disruptors, the podcast where we shift the way we all think about the future and much more. And today we're diving deep into that and some fun stuff. Today we got PZ Myers. Do you like to go by PZ? Should that be
Sure.
what we rock
Yeah.
with? Okay, we got him on the program. He's a smart guy, an atheist, a biologist, and someone who's looking into essentially our past and our future. So thanks for coming today.
Glad to be here.
So I wanted to start out. You had a nice quote. Science and religion are essentially fundamentally at odds. And I think we should start there because it's something that comes up a lot.
Yeah. Well, my version of science is relying on empiricism and observation and experiment in order to get at the truth. And that's not what religion does. Religion is about revelation. They claim to already have the truth. So everything they do is simply rationalizing what they already think they know.
Which is really dangerous because you can never move forward.
Right. And it also is a great way to entrench ridiculous beliefs. I mean, I deal with creationists all the time. And there's a lot of Christians out there who think creationism is ridiculous. But there's also this small group who are busy digging a hole and are insisting that they do not want to get out of this hole. So yeah, it's because of that commitment to an a priori belief that they're getting worse and worse.
And you see it happening with scientists, even like world-class scientists who will try to prove the Earth is 6,000 years old. How does this happen?
Oh, I wish I knew. But in general, what it is you start with a religious belief. You start with a commitment, and then boom, you're not doing experiments. Most of us scientists, when we do experiments, what we're trying to do is disprove our hypothesis, because you can't really prove your hypothesis. All you can do is disprove all the alternatives. And so you go out there and you try and address your science by doing falsification. And that's the last thing a creationist wants to do, is attempt to falsify their beliefs. So they get in deeper and deeper. But it's not just necessarily religious beliefs that do.
Yeah, fake news. We're all doing the exact same thing now. It's
Right.
horrible.
Yeah. But like another example is Paul Davies, the physicist, who's very full of himself and thinks he has discovered a new approach to cancer. And you read his stuff, he keeps coming out with this. He just recently came out with an article where he's talking about his new theory of cancer, which he came up with 10 years ago. So I don't think it's new anymore. But you read it and it's laughable. It's the kind of thing somebody who has no background in biology or specifically cancer research would propose as a hypothesis.
What's the hypothesis, out of curiosity?
Paul Davies argues that cancers are atavisms. That what they're doing is a cancer is a cell that has reverted to a Precambrian state of existence, and that it's exercising a program that evolved for single-celled life forms in ancient seas, and it's a survival strategy for the cell, he says. And it's basically Haeckel's recapitulation reborn, and it's total garbage. But he's getting money for it, and he's getting published for it.
That's part of the problem with science, is you have to say something outlandish to even get noticed these days. I guess not just science.
Is that true? I don't know. Well, it depends. I mean, there's a lot of really good work being done in cancer research, for instance. And the work that we respect is good, solid, well-founded research, that's got empirical numbers, it's got statistics, it's got actual evidence that therapies work. But it doesn't get everybody's attention. If you've got an approach that yields a 2% increase in the survival rate of patients of a particular kind of cancer, that's not news. It's great news for the people with that cancer, but it doesn't make the headlines.
Is there a way to fix that? Now, 2%, I will say 2% isn't huge by any means.
Right.
It was interesting. I was talking to somebody and he was saying, wouldn't it be great if we could have a drug that had a 20% efficacy rate? You would be 100% cured if you were in that 20% and it killed everyone else. Because as long as we figured out who that 20% was that it worked for, it's something much better than the rest of the medicine. So it's kind of like that personalized approach, but you have to be more extreme doing that instead of focusing
Yeah.
off a
Well,
broad.
when you look at what hospitals are doing, hospitals compile an awful lot of research statistics, and there what you see is, yeah, they're thrilled with a 2% increase. If you're getting that 2% every year, you're getting this incremental improvement. If you're constantly honing your techniques and you're getting better at diagnosis and you're getting better at treatment, uh, you don't see what you're describing. You don't see a suddenly 20% of the patients are fine. And no, what you see instead is a lot of variation, but you can kind of work your way in the correct direction and incrementally improve the odds. And that's the game they're in. It would be lovely if somebody came up with a radical new approach that, for instance, years ago, Judah Folkman came up with his theory that angiogenesis was central to cancer, and that was a big change. But again, what you discover when you do that is you don't suddenly get everyone cured. You get improvement in some therapies, and others where it's disappointing. And yeah, that's the mundane reality of science.
Yeah, I've seen some compelling stuff that seems to be each cancer or a lot of cancers have different mechanisms of action or of cause. So you can't really there's no such thing as a universal cure, especially between individuals.
Exactly. And then of course the other thing is cancers evolve. So you get something that is effective against, one type of cancer in your system right then, but then they're constantly mutating. And so you got another cancer that comes along in the same patient a little longer, derived from the original stock, and your therapy doesn't work anymore. So
Good metaphor for religion. So, so how do we deal with that? Because a lot of people listening to that will feel offended when I say that, and part of that is the point. That's part of the reason I wanted to get you on is people need to think outside the box. But I think looking backwards, that I would say there's been huge negatives caused by a lot of the world religions worldwide. And there's been some positive in that it's been some type of force. Even if we are unifying against each other, we are unifying for something. But we seem to have evolved beyond that point.
yeah, well, when I think about it and I try to figure out what's so great about religion, like you say, there are some positives, and a lot of the positives are about social cohesion and people working together and people finding common cause. All stuff that you can do without requiring that you believe in Jesus, right? So it's all the supposed positives of religion could actually be equally well regarded as positives of humanism. So, yeah, okay. I've never heard a compelling argument for a real positive advantage to religion.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily positive now. It's kind of positive in the aspect of I can have carrots or I can have mashed potatoes or I can have McDonald's. If I eat the mashed potatoes, it's a little bit better than the McDonald's, but it's certainly nowhere near the carrots. But somewhere along the line, we found our way to the mashed potatoes and we stuck with them because we liked them. And
Yeah,
and it's something where we can take the analogy further as we get fatter and fatter and it becomes less sustainable, we might need to get off the mashed potatoes. But we don't want to because we like them. We're hooked on them.
right.
Do you see any way
Yeah.
to do that peacefully?
Oh, peacefully. Yeah, well, it's got to be done peacefully. Violence wouldn't solve anything. When you get aggressively violent with somebody's deepest held beliefs, you just get resistance, and it makes them stronger in their belief, unfortunately. What's the way around it? Well, I think it's gonna require an incremental evolution to get away from it. That what we find is that in progressive societies, you get less and less religious belief, right? And it's because you raise up a kid with a healthy attitude, who looks on the world in a positive way, actually gets value from doing science or a science-like approach. They naturally just sort of wean themselves away from religion. So, we just have to do it generation by generation, and eventually get rid of religion that way. Not that we'll ever totally get rid of it, but we can try.
But what about that evolution aspect that we were talking about with cancer and with viruses? They adapt to the circumstances. They change the rules. They change what's involved in the books. They try to make things more palatable to modernity, albeit sacrificing the originalness and the reality of what something was.
Yes, and you see religion doing this all the time. I don't know if you've ever gone to a Unitarian Universalist church, but they're kind of representative of that, where they still maintain all the form of a church and religion, but they don't really believe in a deity. They don't have a holy book. They've just sort of discarded those things. And I don't find them viable. I think they're fine in the short term. And if you're into that sort of thing, great. But um, I don't think they're going to capture the imagination and thrive in future generations. So, yeah, you can take religion and dilute it, but the weaker you make it, the less appealing it becomes.
Yeah, eventually, if we want to make heroin or cocaine, if you make it not potent enough, then eventually you go back to something else.
Right. Yeah. And so I think that the best strategy for us is to just keep plugging away, set religion aside, set a personal example, do good stuff, do fun stuff, learn, all that kind of thing. And that's how we will outlast them, because we'll ultimately be much more appealing, I think.
So there are some things we're losing today in society, that sense of connectedness, as we're talking between a screen, which is still good, but we see a lot less social cohesion happening. We see a lot less people involved in groups and memberships, getting out in their communities, etc. Religion, that was something that was always good at that. And while it had plenty of cons, that was definitely a pro that we are losing. How do we replace that when people are getting lonelier and lonelier? They're killing themselves because they're stuck on Facebook all day and they can't help it, and Zuckerberg's evil. What do we do about that?
Well, again, I think it's a matter of evolving away from it. Right now, one of the problems is that our proxies for social cohesion are things like Facebook. And like you say, Facebook is evil and it's crap. It really does a poor job of that function. What we need to do is find alternatives. We need to find ways to bring people together, in this high-tech, spiffy way that we've got, that somehow has lasting value to people. And it's not just religion. I've been seeing this for the last decade, that there was a time when atheist meetings were really, really popular, and they were huge. And you get swarms of people coming in, and you get all these people that show up, and they were so excited because for the first time they're in a group where they can actually express their views without having to justify everything about it. And those are fading. Those, we're just seeing less and less of that now. And I think the old conference format just isn't cutting it anymore.
Any theories as to why? Is that just our attention spans? Is that our desire to be around others? Is it something else? Too much interesting stuff going on? Too much Netflix?
That could be part of it. Yeah. Yeah, I gotta admit, a good Netflix movie is much more entertaining than an atheist conference. Um, but part of it is simply what I've been seeing is growing dissension among, for instance, atheists, where once upon a time it was exciting enough to get together and say, "Oh, hey, we don't believe in God. We believe in separation of church and state, all this kind of stuff, and that unites us." And what's happened over the last decade is that increasingly more and more of the people who are the big draws for atheist conferences have proven to be a little bit deplorable. And the better you get to know someone, the more things you find to disagree with. And that has kind of split the community in a lot of ways. That go ahead.
To be fair though, media pressure does that on everyone. If you really get someone that has, and if you look at, I mean, if you look at least US media and US norms, I would imagine if you were to take anyone and put them under a microscope, they're going to come out not looking ideal. I imagine if you get someone who's attacking the institution of what most of society is built around, they're definitely going to come out looking not ideal just because of the people that are reporting the news.
Oh, well, yeah, and it's human nature. I mean, every political campaign, this happens. Every election year, you'll get a whole bunch of candidates out there, and the media will focus on showing how each one sucks. And that's kind of an inevitable consequence. And because we're people, all of us have ugly things in our background. We have ugly views. We try to sanitize them for the public, but they're always going to be there. And if you dig deep enough, you'll find them. Even me.
Even this guy.
Yeah.
How do you think about Buddhism and a more personalized spiritual approach as replacing a more conventional religion?
The more personalized approach, sure. I don't know about Buddhism. Buddhism is kind of a fad. My wife lived in Thailand for a year, a very Buddhist country, and when you're right there in the middle of these countries of the East that have Buddhism as a foundational belief, you discover that no, it's just like religions everywhere. They'd like to say that there's no deity, but then they sort of revere Buddha and statues of Buddha, that there are all kinds of rituals and dogma and prohibitions about dealing with these idols and things like that. What we've got here in the US typically is a kind of sanitized, stripped down version of Buddhism, where it's just meditation and personal beliefs and like the oneness of the universe and things like that. But I would think that a lot of Eastern Buddhists would call that not Buddhism at all.
Is that the trick, to just get rid of the garbage from religion and keep the good stuff?
That would be a nice trick. I don't know if that so much of what I read about the incorporation of Eastern philosophies into Western belief systems is just utter silliness. Carry it to an extreme and you just get Deepak Chopra. And I don't think Deepak Chopra is an improvement over the Pope or anybody else.
Okay. Where do you see humanity headed? What worries you the most?
Oh, I'm 61 years old. There's a lot of things that worry me. I have become increasingly cynical and disappointed in the universe as I get older. There are some real problems with physical things like global climate change. That's always going to be a big worry, and especially since we don't seem to be doing anything to correct it. If I wanted to be a little bit more biological and a little weirder, I would say a bigger change coming down the pike. That if we survive global climate change, the next step that we're going to have to worry about is poorly considered changes to the human species that are going to be coming along. That it's becoming increasingly easy to modify genomes, and we have no idea what we're doing there. Yeah, you can go in and tweak things, but everything in the genome is interlinked with everything else, and you wiggle one little piece and you're changing everything. And the biohackers, they kind of worry me because I don't think they're very bright. They've got the techniques. They understand pharmacology, but they don't understand how human systems are assembled, and they're going to screw it up. I just know it.
Even the ones that are bright, it's just when you're dealing with There's the unknown unknowns. You don't know what you don't know.
Right. And the ones that are really dangerous are the ones who are confident that they do know the unknowns when they don't. And they just charge in and start adjusting things in dangerous ways. So, on priorities, I would say the imminent threat is things like global climate change, overpopulation, pollution. You know, we are demolishing the ecosystem, and we rely on that to survive. Those are approximate causes, and if we get through those, the next step is the shape of humanity. When we acquire the ability to change that shape, what are we going to change it to?
Speaking of changing that shape, your first blog, the one that got acquired by National Geographic, was called Pharyngula. I think I'm pronouncing
Fringo,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, close to right. Tell me a little bit more about the meaning of that and why it's important. Why would you title a blog something that's almost impossible to even spell?
But no, it's easy. It's obvious. Everyone knows fringulas. No, it's because, well, I never set up a blog to be some kind of popular mass culture sort of thing. That the blog was just an opportunity for me to express myself. I had recently moved to Morris, Minnesota, which is a very small town out in the upper Midwest. Uh, it's a really nice university. It's kind of an elite liberal arts university, but it's small and specialized. So I'm the sole developmental biologist here, and I kind of felt this need to communicate more regularly with other people who were interested in the same things I was. So I set up this blog way back when. It's still going, by the way. It's still called Pharyngula. And it's really just an outlet for me to say, here's stuff I think is cool. Here's stuff that really annoys me. You know, get off my lawn, that sort of thing.
Clint Eastwood style. What is a Pharyngula? I was listening to a talk you had.
Yeah, a Pharyngula. It's a word coined by Bill Ballard to describe a particular stage in embryonic development. So you've heard of a blastula or a gastrula, and there's a neurula. So blastula is when you're forming the initial population of cells that are going to move and differentiate into the various tissues. A gastrula is a step where everything is moving inwards to generate the three germ layers, endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. Neurula is the stage where the nervous system is starting to form. And then the next stage after that is called the Pharyngula. And the Pharyngula in a vertebrate is a stage when the embryo is forming things like gill arches, branchial arches, when it's forming major organ systems, when genes like the Hox genes are being expressed to set up the organization of the body plan. So it's everything before that is kind of here, just set up the general tissues that we need to work with. And then the Pharyngula stage is when the information is generated to create things like the body plan and the form of the organism. And it just happens to be the stage I was most interested in studying. And so, when I'm trying to think of what am I going to call this blog? Everyone has a name for their blog. I thought, well, this is what I do. I work with Phäryngulas. So there it was.
And the way I heard you describe it, it was similar to a construction site. They come, they dump all the stuff there, and then it's just sitting there. Nothing's been really
Yes.
commenced yet. Basically, everything was kind of the same until then.
Right. So in the Pharyngula stage, if you've heard of the Hox genes, for instance, set up the anterior posterior axis of the animal, and they specify, oh, this is a head. This is where you're going to make the forelimbs. Here's where you're going to make the hind limbs. Here's where you're going to make the tail. So in some ways, what's going on in the Pharyngula stage is like the architects and engineers have shown up on the site where all the materials are laid out, and they've staked out, here's where you're going to build this, and here's where you're going to build that, and lay out the entire plan of the construction.
And yet it kind of proves that evolutionarily, what's the significance?
Oh, evolutionarily, what the significance of is that the Pharyngula stage is a highly conserved stage. So everything before that is less conserved, and everything after that is less conserved. So it's like, you know, when you're bringing in the stuff to the construction site, you know, some places you might bring it in by train, others you might bring it in by truck. You might have bricks or you might have boards, whatever. The construction materials can vary. So everything in the early stages is highly variable. But in order to build a viable multicellular organism, you have to have this general plan that's laid out in the Fharyngula stage. And that's consistent across the vertebrata. So all chordates do the same thing of laying out this floor plan, the body plan of the organism at the Fharyngula stage. But then after that, things can diverge. You know, obviously they diverge because you and I are human beings and we're not chimpanzees and we're not turtles and all these other organisms. They all went through this Fharyngula stage, which is very similar in all of us. And then you get the species-specific variation occurring after that.
What does that mean from a Darwinist perspective of how evolution happens?
Oh, now you get into some interesting stuff, because back in the 19th century, you know, have you heard of Haeckel, Ernst Haeckel?
Only from your talks earlier.
Yeah. So after Darwin announced his theory, Ernst Haeckel came along with his own theory, which was a recapitulation theory, which says that every organism goes through all the stages of its ancestors to develop. And then what you do is you add new stuff at the end of that developmental sequence. And the idea was that you would then be able to trace through the evolutionary history of your organisms by just looking at animals developing. And you would say, well, okay, there was a time back in the Precambrian when we were going through a gastrula stage, and then we evolved into the, you know, the Neurula stage, and then we developed into the, which is, it's all bogus. None of that's true. That's not what happens. Where it's has modern consequences is when we try to think about how you can change an organism. And there are some things you can change, you know, in an evolutionary sense that are fairly straightforward and others that are really difficult. So one of the things we can say, because it's so consistent, is that it's really hard to modify the Fharyngula stage in any significant way. One example of that was like for us tetrapods, we are all four-limbed animals, right? Think about it. You go across the vertebrates and you look at all the terrestrial animals and they all have only four limbs. That's because at the Fharyngula stage, you lay out where the limbs will go. You specify, okay, four limbs here, hind limbs there. We don't have a way to go in, well, evolution couldn't find a way to go in and say, oh man, it'd be really useful to have six limbs. Let's put one in the middle. They can't, because that would disrupt the entire body plan to go in and just change it so radically. So you see these constraints in evolution, and parts of them are developmental constraints like that one that says, no, you can't do that. Because if you make that change at this really critical, sensitive time in development, you're disrupting everything, and everything will fall into chaos, and you won't get a viable organism out of it. So we're stuck with four limbs.
You can't build a basement if you haven't dug the foundations first. So does that mean if we were to find just life on other planets, odds are they'll have similar types of limitations? For instance, most of them will probably have the same number of limbs, the same number of heads, etc.
No,
Not as us, but as themselves and other creatures.
They will have limitations, of course, developmental constraints on their development, but they will be different. That, for example, when we look back at the history of vertebrates, there's, you know, we all have these 5 digits at the ends of our hands and feet. You find some organisms, like many amphibians, of course, have reduced that to 3 or even 2. When you go back in the early history of vertebrates, what you discover is that they were experimenting with different arrangements of digits. And for instance, some of the early amphibians had 13 digits on each hand. but they didn't make it. So you could imagine a situation on a different planet where, for this, in a similar way, they're tinkering with what's a good number of digits to have? What's a way to build a set of fingers, if they have fingers? What's a good way to specify the number of limbs? And they could all come up with different solutions.
Evolutionarily, is it easier to get rid of something or to add? I feel like with a tree, you can snip a bud, and that makes things a lot easier than having to grow a new branch.
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer, actually.
Very good.
Yeah, it seems reasonable to say it's easier to lose a pathway. However, one of the big problems that arose in the early 20th century is something called Mueller's ratchet, where he noticed that, if you look at how genetics works and how evolution works, it's also incredibly easy to add duplicates of part of a pathway. So Mueller's ratchet argues that, well, it's really easy just to make a copy of this gene. So now you got two of those genes, and those two genes are working together to generate some structure, and initially just redundancy. But what could happen is one of those copies acquires a new mutation, and it does something subtly different, just a little bit different initially. And then what will happen is, if that's advantageous, it will be reinforced. So you'll tend to get this increase in the number of genes in an organism just because of that simple mechanic. So that's why it's called a ratchet, is because it only goes one way. And it gets to the point where you've got this new duplicate, it's got this new function, and you can't delete it without losing all of the other functions associated with it. So things, terminal deletions. If you're going to delete something that does something fairly trivial on the surface, those you can easily lose. But things that are deep in a pathway are really tricky because they've got so many dependencies associated with them that when you start knocking them out, you knock out more than just the one gene. You knock out a whole bunch of things.
And that's kind of what we're learning now with CRISPR and Cas9, is when we make changes, other things happen.
Correct. Yeah. That there's a new buzzword floating around in the scientific community. It's called Omnigenic. It's the idea that every single gene affects every other feature in the organism. And so, you can't simply excise. It would be nice to say, hey, can we develop something that would just add another limb or delete a limb? Turns out you can't do that very easily. It's because there's so many things tied with it. You can reshape a limb, but you can't really totally get rid of it.
Well, it's like sickle cell anemia. It was great for a while, and it's terrible now. It was something that was designed to help people survive malaria.
Oh, we don't use the word design.
Very, very true. We do not use the word design. It was something that we stumbled into that was very helpful.
Yes, it was an accidental kludge that had just happened to help you survive malaria. It had other side effects.
How do you look at genes and traits? So, for instance, some things are advantageous, but they aren't ubiquitous. So you'll see cats that have seven. I've heard seven-toed cats is something that is recessive.
Yeah.
It keeps coming. We're all getting brown hair. What is the actual structure of how that works? Do we really understand that?
Well, sort of, yeah. I mean, polydactyl cats, for instance, the gene has been identified that causes that. It's basically an error in Hox gene expression in the terminal limb bud. Things like hair color, oh yeah, we know what genes are involved there. The thing is, there are multiple genes involved in both of those pathways. Oh, there was recently an interesting paper, was it in Nature, about red hair. That for a long time people argue, well, red hair, it's just caused by a single gene change. This gene that regulates the synthesis of melanin. But what they did is when they started probing deeper into hair color, they discovered that, for instance, there are something like 200 alleles, that are 200 genes that affect the darkness of your hair. So there's all this stuff going on. It's and it makes sense when you look at the world around you. You don't find that all red-haired people have exactly the same shade of red hair, right? Same with brown hair. There's all kinds of variations. Once upon a time, my beard was brown, but it had streaks of red in it. There's these subtle variations that are all over the place. So there are a great many genes that influence these. So yeah, there's an increasing appreciation of the fact that no, there's not just one simple gene that controls everything. There's a whole host of them that cooperate to create a structure.
Is that one of the most dangerous things in science? Let's say I give you a paper and I ask you to proofread, and I say it has one error in it. You're going to look until you find that error, and then you're probably not going to look quite as hard after that because suddenly you're ready to publish.
Yeah, it's there, and there's kind of a selection for this sort of thing that everyone loves the simple, clear answer. Gene X does Y. That's what we want to hear. And people don't want to hear. It's harder to publish. Gene X contributes 20% to Y. And these other genes over here probably do something else. It's also a consequence of the reductionist approach to science. That what we generally do in science is we start paring away all the variables. We try to get the simplest system we can. And that process of removing the variables is also affecting the result. So when you've got the system simple enough so that you can isolate, for instance, the effect of a single gene, you've also, before you did your experiment, you got rid of everything that might have affected it. And that's going to bias your results. So
Yeah.
oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say that for a long time I've worked on zebrafish, and zebrafish are just a marvelous system to work with. They're a really elegant model system. They're vertebrates, so it's easier to get grant money for them. They're simple. They share a lot of the same features that we do, in slightly different ways, of course, because they're fish. But at the same time, zebrafish are a highly inbred species. They're lab-bred species. The original stock was collected at the height of the British Empire. Well, at the beginning of the British Empire, actually, I think it was like 1835 or something. And they've been inbred ever since. So, for example, when George Streisinger, who's the guy who really got zebrafish on the map, started his experiment, he just went to the pet store, got some fish, he bred them together, and discovered this remarkable thing that they have almost no lethal alleles. So you can do things like make homozygous zebrafish, and they live. This doesn't expose some terrible recessive allele that causes a disease that kills them instantly, as would happen if you did that with a human being. So they've had a lot of the variation in the genome bred out of them, which makes them handy as a model system, but not so handy if you're trying to work out all the details of what generates a particular variation.
How do you think about the scientific research that we have now? We experiment on a lot of animals to try to find out better ways of essentially making human beings stronger, healthier, sexier, live longer, cure disease, all kinds of things. But yet the models don't necessarily correlate perfectly. How do you think about that, and where do you think we're headed?
Well, it is definitely true. I mean, the model systems aren't perfect. They are not people, and they have their own unique specialization. So of course you're going to get variations. The way we tend to compensate for that is you try multiple model systems, right? So if you're working on a drug therapy, for instance, and you test it in mice, and you find it's effective in mice, what you then do is you try other model systems. Does it work in cats? Does it work in rats? You try preliminary trials with humans and try and see if you get similar effects. You work on cells and tissue culture. So yeah, they're all uniquely different, but by looking at multiple systems, You are searching for something that shares common functionality, and then you can make conclusions about it. Or you can end up deciding, well, hey, this is great for treating cancer in rats, but it's terrible for treating cancer in people. And that happens.
It's trend lines, but when do you decide to make that jump to people? So, for instance, we did this episode will come out in a month or two. We'll see. But we had the CRISPR babies born not all that long ago, and we don't really know what's going to happen there.
Yeah, that's an interesting, because that guy skipped all the ethical standards. he just ignored all the standards that people have developed for doing this kind of research. So who knows? But it's an unethical bit of work that he did. So it's kind of unfair to compare that to regular science. How do we know when you've got something that's worth marketing to people that will actually help them? Part of the problem is I use the word marketing. So a lot of the companies, it's when does it look like it's going to be lucrative? Is this cheap to make, and can we sell it for lots of money? Then let's do it. Maybe it's not as efficacious as we think, but hey, we're going to make money. But otherwise, it's a matter of, I'm on the basic side of science. I do basic science, and this is more applied science. So I'm not the most expert person to be talking about it. But I do know that the protocols for testing drugs and things like that are demanding to an extreme, that you require so many trials with, mice models, for instance, first, and then you've got to work your way up. You've got to do the basic clinical trials first, just to test. You get a small population, you just test. Can we give them this drug at a safe dose? So what is the safe dose to treat them with? And you work through a concentration series and see that if it actually harms people or does anything at any of these concentrations. Then you go through clinical trials where you select people and you run them through. It's expensive and demanding, and it requires a lot of animals and a lot of people to work this stuff out. So
Yeah, bring up the CRISPR example, because I think humanity has the ability to be very easily desensitized to things, desensitized to violence. I think the next politician that runs and wants to say the other guy's an asshole and he's got a big butt and things like that will be much easier now that Trump has gotten rid of all of our standards. I think that we go through, and when we sign up for a new service, we don't read the 100 pages about how they're selling our mom to slave owners in Idaho so that they can have access to our information, yada yada. Basically, we've kind of become desensitized to the things that become common. And with CRISPR, with something like this, is this something where the pros, the possibility, just the fact that it's happened already will suddenly lead to a takeoff event, so to speak, where suddenly it's happening all the time? Because sure, this is what the FDA says, but to be honest, little Johnny needs something, so I could give a shit what the FDA says.
right. Well, the CRISPR babies, the guy is arguing that the father of these two children was HIV positive. So, we need to help these kids so that they don't get the disease as well. Meanwhile, AIDS doesn't transfer that easily, and
He wanted to be famous.
yeah, that was the big thing. But yeah, this will always happen, that people will make an argument that, we should do this for this altruistic means, and it won't always be altruistic. There are these people who, for instance, are injecting themselves with all kinds of things right now. Like, who is that guy, the biohacker who injected himself with a disease? Well, not with a disease, with a gene to increase muscle size. This was done recently. He just sort of jammed himself. The thing is that most of that's going to be totally ineffective. It's not going to do a thing. So there's going to be a lot of wasted effort there. And even if it did work, we wouldn't know how to replicate it. That's another reason that scientific trials, clinical trials, are so demanding and so rigorous, is that we have to figure out all the parameters, all the variables, so we can make it do the right thing that we want it to do again. And when you don't do that, you can't replicate.
What's the most realistic science book, video, movie, etc. that you prescribe to, at least in terms of these type of topics?
Oh, what movie should you watch to oh gosh. Yeah, I'm at the opposite end of being desensitized to this. I'm hypersensitive to variations in scientific treatments in movies, and they all make me they all leave me horrified. Um, I watched Lucy a while back. It was just, oh man, how did this ever get past the first script? Anyway, there's lots of really bad ones out there. Lots of people will cite things like Gattaca, and the thing is, Gattaca isn't really about the science. Gattaca is about the abuse of science by a political system. And in that sense, I think Gattaca is a pretty good cautionary tale that you can have this mythological view of how precise genetics is, and that can lead to some really bad conclusions about how to run your society. Uh, but unfortunately, Gattaca doesn't actually get at the science of determining traits from genetics. Trying to think if there's anyone. Oh man, no! Don't go to the movies to learn science. That's
No,
my lesson.
I will agree with that there. If you guys like
Yeah,
this, support us on Patreon, guys.
yeah,
Disruptors.fm/Patreon. Gattaca is really interesting. I think one of the big problems with having a view like that, though, is the best science I've seen to date says you're roughly 50% nurture and 50% nature. So the environment around you is impacting your genes in such a way that we can't even really begin to understand, let alone just understanding the genes you have that are in there and on and off.
exactly. That I would say the science of Gattaca is crap. That no, you can't do that. But I would also point out that the political science of Gattaca is the way this scientific information can be used is spot on. That we've got people right now who are arguing for distinct racial differences that drive behavior, and you get the bell curve arguing, oh well, if you're black, you're committed to being inferior mentally. Um, that's the attitude that Gattaca just ramped up to 11, but it's out there.
I don't think he argued that it was fundamentally. I think the bell curve guy gets a bad rap. I think the reason why he looked into the science is questionable at best, but I don't think that necessarily the science was that questionable. But that's something where we're trying to get him on the program.
Oh, that's too bad. He's terrible. He doesn't know biology. Um, yeah, as you said earlier, there is an environmental contribution, there's a genetic contribution. And if you talk to modern biologists, what they'll tell you is that those are inseparable, that evolution is modifying the expression of genetic information is modifying how you interact with the environment. And to even try to separate them out is a futile attempt. So, when you've got somebody arguing that there are certain conditions in society that are favorable for one race over another race, I would think that poverty is unfavorable for every race, and it's really hard to sort
Definitely.
it out.
I would agree with that. I push back against people that think that everyone is the same because inherently we see such large differences in everything that it would be. I mean, if we were all 100% equal, then I think there's our proof for God. If we're
Yeah,
going into the probabilities there, if we were all 100% the same in everything, then
right.
it's a point. It's not really one that needs
Yeah.
discussing. What are you most excited about these days? What technologies, industries, advancements, etc. get you most interested and pumped up?
Oh, well, right now, personally, it's spiders.
Really? Are you Spider-Man? Tell me.
Yeah, spider old guy. Um, no, I mentioned earlier that I've been working with zebrafish for a long time, and recently I just switched over to um, building up a spider colony. And there's a couple of reasons for that. That the general principle that's got me really excited right now, that the thing that I'm most enthused about digging into in a general sense, is this field called ecological developmental science. EcoDevo for sure, short. You've probably heard of EvoDevo. There's also this thing called EcoDevo, which is trying to map out the interactions between the environment and developmental processes. It's the same thing we're just talking about, how things are, it's environment and genetics are working together. And this is saying, yeah, it's environment, it's ecology and development are working together to shape organisms. And I switched from zebrafish because zebrafish, you can't do that. Zebrafish are not found in the United States. They're definitely not found in Minnesota. You have to go to India to work on them in their natural environment. So we don't have this pool of variation present in the natural population. So I've been kind of looking around for, what's a good organism that's ubiquitous, that's everywhere, that's easy to work with, and that will have a lot of natural variation in the population, and that you could then ask, how does it interact with its environment? And spiders are just a natural one to pick because they're pretty easy to work with. They're adorable. People don't generally, you generally don't find people using pesticides against spiders, for instance, which will be a problem with working with a lot of agriculturally important organisms. So it means we can just look at how are they interacting with humans in their natural environment. So that's my long-term goal right now is let's work out the ecological conditions around spiders, and let's look how that affects their early development.
And how does that get scaled out? What is the broader scale view of how that affects ecology, humanity, society as large?
Well, there's a couple ways. First of all, let me mention, as I said, I'm a basic scientist. I don't care. I don't care whether it saves people's lives or anything. I'm more interested in just looking at the basic knowledge of how do these things work together. But the kinds of things we're looking at right now is the spider species I'm working with is synanthropic. That means it lives with human beings. So they're in your house right now, and they require human beings to survive. They would not survive a Minnesota winter, for instance, but by huddling in your house, they can last out even minus 20 degrees centigrade. So that's one interesting aspect of them, is how do they interact with human beings. But another is we are changing our environment in dangerous ways. There was an interesting article in the New York Times a couple weeks ago about the insect apocalypse, that we're seeing a decline in insect numbers all across the country, and nobody knows why. So one of the things I'm interested in is just, okay, spiders depend on insects. Are we going to be able to monitor a change in spider populations that correlates with changes in insect populations? Can I go out, I'm in rural Midwestern United States. Can I go out to local farms and find, where they use a lot of pesticides and herbicides, and can I find a difference in the spider populations there versus here in town, where we tend not to spray those things all over the place? So the idea is to use this as a model to work out how human intervention affects another organism.
It's so complicated. There's so many variables, the number of homes, the number of dumpsters. It's yeah, science is hard.
Yeah, I know that I've been working. So I'm gonna, this spring, I'm gonna be getting together with a bunch of people. We're gonna go out to various houses, and one of the things I got to work out is a questionnaire that just asks all these things about how they manage their house, because those are variables that affect the spiders. Do you keep a cluttered garage, for instance? Do you actually sweep out cobwebs in your garage? Those are going to make a difference. So I want to take a look at that and see what's going on. Uh, is your garage located right next to a garden that you spray herbicides on? So I've got to get all those variables worked out ahead of time so that we can do this survey and ask, okay, what's happening to the spider populations in this area?
That's a tough one. So there's got to be a story here of some kind, and I want to get into that a little before we wrap up.
Okay.
You're a pretty well known, well respected atheism / anti-creationism advocate, and I'm curious why. What's your story? What was it like growing up?
Oh man, it's a boring story. I'm sorry. I grew up in a very liberal household. My my father was, radically pro-union, was pretty much an unbeliever himself. Um, Growing up, I attended the Lutheran Church as a child, but I never really believed. And this was one of those nice, soft, evangelical Lutheran churches that, yeah, you can do anything you want. When I went to my pastor and said, I think I'm an atheist, he said, "Oh, that's okay." So it was a very low pressure sort of environment. So I can't argue that I'm having some virulent reaction against my conservative upbringing because I didn't have one of those. What really got me going is, I made an early commitment to science. This is my career. I wanted to be a scientist. I really wanted to understand biology because that was my focus. Is really interested in biological organisms, and I became radicalized when I went to college. And have you been to college recently?
It's a
There's
lot.
all Yeah, there's always some weird preacher who will come onto campus and, hector the students. Yeah, you're all going to hell, you lesbians, and things like this. And I got into listening to some of these people. So, I attended some of their talks, and they were horrible. They completely mangled biology, and it made me angry to see that here are these people who are apparently respected by somebody, and they're coming into a campus and they're lying to the students. So, for example, almost 20 years ago, when I started here at Morris, teaching at the University of Minnesota Morris, I was horrified to discover that I was teaching cell biology, and outside my classroom, there was a youth pastor who had put up little signs telling the students that they should come to his talks and they would learn about the lies you were being taught in cell biology.
It's brilliant as an targeted advertising.
Yes. And I actually went to a couple of his sessions, just quietly sat in the back and didn't disrupt or anything. But basically what he was doing is showing Kent Hovind videos. Kent Hovind knows nothing about biology. He's a terribly ignorant person. And that kind of thing just infuriated me that, I'm investing all this time and effort into teaching young people the best science that we know, and there is a group of people out there who are actively conspiring to undermine it. And I started off just getting infuriated at college level interventions from these people, but then you discover how poorly you're taught in public schools about this stuff. And I realized all of a sudden that when I was growing up, they never mentioned the evolution word in any of the classes I took in grade school. And I grew up in this liberal Seattle suburb, right? You wouldn't think there was a problem there, but it was never ever discussed, and it just sort of sunk in that that's really weird. I had spent a lot of time in the library reading about it, but it was all self-taught, all going off and reading the books to find out what was going on. But realizing that it had, in addition to the people actively preaching lies, there were people who were suppressing the teaching of good science in the schools. That really bothered me. And that's where I started getting really on their case.
all in the name of love and happiness, we need to hate each other and find differences, right? That's what gets
Yeah,
us to the good place.
yeah, and it's an unfortunate thing too, because as I said, there's a lot of Christians out there who do not believe this garbage, who are fine with science, um, who are not intolerant bigots. And what's happening is that there's this powerful group that has a lot of influence that is doing the opposite, that is preaching bigotry and ignorance. And as we were talking about earlier, what can you do about this? The thing is that it's not just passively being communicated; it is active miscommunication that is trying to undermine people's understanding of the world. And I feel a responsibility to get up and speak out against it.
Yeah, it's tough. Gandhi can only win so many battles when the other side has bullets. And
Yeah, I mean that's one approach is okay. We'll just sit back and we will teach science the best we can, but at the same time, there are people who are teaching anti-science the best they can, and you know,
Putin's killing it with that. He's great with these Facebook trolls.
right? Yeah, and part of the problem too is that I will freely confess this, that us scientists tend to be a non-charismatic bunch. We're not selected for how persuasive we are. We're selected for how well we understand the science. And you go up against a preacher, these guys have that's all they're selected for is rhetoric and presentation and willingness to lie persuasively.
I don't even think necessarily it's lying. I think it's ignorance. So
Yeah.
I think it definitely depends on the person. I mean, you see a lot of these evangelicals with like the $8 million mansions and just crushing it. That's another story. But I don't think it's necessarily lying. And I think it's
Uh-huh.
dangerous to. I think it's dangerous to call it lying. I think it's much more unconscious, willful ignorance on
Yeah,
on the part of people that think they're doing the right thing, but have never really questioned what that right thing is.
right. That that what muddies the waters here is you are considering their intent. That they're not intending to lie. They don't mean to be dishonest in their presentation. And I'm sitting here saying that's true. I agree that yeah, it is just ignorance, but intent doesn't matter. That when you're doing this sort of when you're working so hard, there ought to be an obligation if you are an anti-evolutionist to actually understand evolution as evolutionary biologists present it, and they feel no motivation to do that. And that turns it from, oh, well, I just don't know. If I don't know something, if I'm not positive about something, I'll just say, I'm going to have to go look that up and learn some more about it. I don't come down solidly on one side or the other. And if I did, that would be misrepresenting my awareness of the subject.
That's good. There's no nuance, and I think the nuance needs to be there.
Yeah,
Because you can't. Yeah, I,
yeah,
I and this is not to say everyone listening that all religious people are evil or anything of that nature.
yeah.
If you guys haven't figured out how things work, then that's perfectly fine. I would invite people to read the Old and the New Testament. In one, we have an asshole that picks favorites, and in the new one, we love everyone and we're really nice and cuddly. That I think that alone is enough to make you question things. But that was what did it for me personally. I was Catholic for quite a long time and have since escaped that to look more into the nature of reality. But that's enough on my high horse, so to speak. Is there anything else that you think people should know? Do you have a quote, a call to action, anything you want to leave people with?
Oh, well, if I were to make a call for action, it would be to get motivated at the local level. That one of the things that is really crippling us right now is that the forces of ignorance have been smart. They've been really clever by going for the grassroots, by doing things like signing up for school boards, running for school board positions, city council, working, you know, working with local PTAs, all that sort of stuff really makes a big difference in how schools respond. And on the flip side, most of us are thinking, that's a lot of boring, grinding work. And I'm really smart and I have a PhD. I should aim higher than that. So yeah, if I'm not running for president of the United States, I'm not going to do it. And that's been a problem. It's because what's happened now is we've got school boards. School boards are nightmares right now. They're full of religious people who have religious ideological motivations for crippling education. And we need more people like me and you doing that sort of thing.
Paul Graham's a famous accelerator startup guy. He runs Y Combinator, and he has an expression: "You got to do things that don't scale, at least initially." Yeah. And I think that's a good explanation of that. I also think, though, when you are selling to typically more intelligent people, there's more effort that needs to go in versus the flip side. You can kind of just look at that. I mean, if you look at just education levels across states, you can kind of see where certain things trend. Is there anything else that you're worried about?
Anything else? Well, let me go back for just a moment. I would argue, though, that working with the school board does scale because it's a place where you can influence a whole lot of people, and you can do things like shape what kind of teachers get hired in the school, which then has other consequences on what happens with the kids who are graduating, and it can change the whole character of a community. So it's not glamorous work, but it does scale.
That's a better point. What was it like moving from Seattle to Morris, Minnesota?
I moved from Seattle to Utah to Philadelphia and then to Morris. It was culture shock for sure. But it's a nice, quiet, safe. I really like living here now. So it's a little bit more bucolic, but it's much more pleasant, and there's no traffic to worry about, which is a real plus.
It's not raining all the time, so you don't have to jump out of a building or something.
Yeah, we're just
that was insensitive. I'm sorry, guys, but Seattle sucks. Seattle sucks for certain reasons. Bezos as well.
Oh, I like the rain.
You like the rain?
I did. I would prefer the rain to minus 20 degrees C.
Okay, I will give you that one. We certainly don't want the rain in minus 20 degrees C.
There wouldn't be rain.
Guys, I want to wish you a Happy New Year. This is actually going to be belated because this is coming out later, but it's New Year when we're recording this, and hopefully you guys have something awesome that you're working on. Any big goals for you this year? I know you said you're not much of a New Year type guy, but I'm going to call you. I'm going to call you out and say I want a goal.
Well, I'm currently on sabbatical, and I've got two goals in my sabbatical. One is to set up this spider system and get some preliminary work so I can put students to work on it. So that's one big goal. That's one I'm advancing on pretty quickly. And the other one is I'm working on a book about developmental biology.
Very cool. That's a good 1-2 punch.
Yeah. So that's enough. I don't have to do anything else.
That is enough. Well, thanks for coming on today. I like PZ. I like the nickname, so we'll stick with that. Where's the best place for people to find you and learn more?
You can find me on Freethought Blogs, freethoughtblogs.com, and in Fharyngula. I won't tell you to go searching for Fharyngula because nobody can spell it. Just go to Freethought Blogs.
And we'll have links and everything in the show notes, guys. And it's PZ Myers, much easier to spell. Thanks for coming on today. This has been fun.
It's been great fun. Talk to you later then.
Talk to you later. Cheers.
Okay.